There's something that happens in organizations that nobody names directly. You get pulled into a meeting, then another, then a recurring one that's been on the calendar for 8 months and has never once produced a decision. You sit there, you contribute, you watch the clock, and you walk out with an action item that will be discussed again next week. And somewhere in the back of your head, you start to wonder if you're the problem. You're not. Here's what's actually happening. Meetings, when they multiply like this, when they become the primary activity instead of the support structure, are not a productivity tool. They're a control mechanism. And the people running them usually don't know that's what they're doing. They just know that calling a meeting feels like leadership. It isn't. It's the performance of leadership without the substance. And it costs you something real. Not hours, years. Watch how it starts. A project exists. It's complex enough that one person shouldn't own the entire outcome. That's reasonable. So a meeting gets scheduled to coordinate. That's actually fine. The meeting produces a decision. People walk out knowing what they're supposed to do. Everyone executes. The work moves, but then something changes. Maybe the leader gets nervous about the pace. Maybe they hear about a competitor doing something similar and want to move faster, which paradoxically means more meetings to make sure everyone's synchronized. Maybe they just got promoted and want to demonstrate control. Whatever the reason, a second meeting gets added, not instead of the first one. In addition, now you're coordinating the coordination. There's a standing meeting about the project, and then a check-in about the standing meeting, and then a steering committee meeting where the check-in results get discussed. And suddenly, what was 1 hour a week is 4. What was one agenda is nested agendas that reference each other in loops that never quite close. The justification is always the same: alignment. We need better alignment. As if everyone in the room doesn't already know what they're supposed to be doing. As if the problem is that people aren't informed, when actually the problem is that no one's taking action because they're all in meetings talking about taking action. The word alignment has become a substitute for decision-making. When a leader says we need alignment, what they often mean is that they're not comfortable with the decision they've made, and they want the room to talk them out of it, or into it, or to spread the blame if it goes wrong. Alignment is a democratic-sounding way to defer. It's a way to turn a decision into a process. And processes are comfortable because they're hard to critique. You can't really fail at a process. You can only say the process was insufficient, which means you need a better process, which means more meetings to design the process for the next set of meetings. Here's the part nobody warns you about. The leaders who rely most heavily on meetings are almost always the ones who are least confident in their own judgment. Think about what a meeting actually does. It distributes the decision. If 10 people are in the room and something goes wrong, no single person is responsible. The manager who couldn't make the call alone now has cover. That's it. That's often why you're there. Not because your input is needed, because your presence dilutes accountability. A strong leader makes the call. They consult when they need information they don't have, then they decide. Weak leaders consult constantly because the consultation is the point. The decision never quite arrives, and the next meeting gets scheduled to revisit what the last one couldn't resolve. You've seen this. You know exactly what I'm describing. The agenda that's been the same for 6 weeks. The update meeting where everyone gives updates that no one acts on. The brainstorm that produces a list that goes into a document that no one opens again. This is the system, and it's designed, even if not intentionally, to protect the person at the top from ever being clearly wrong. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. Meeting culture creates its own economy. The person who schedules the most meetings looks busy. They look connected. They look central to everything. If you're in a room for 6 hours a day, you can't do much work, which means no one can evaluate your work, which means they have to evaluate your presence instead. And you're always present. You're at every meeting. You're responsive. You're engaged. You're building relationships. These are all things that look like success in a meeting-focused organization, even if they correlate with zero actual output. Meetings are also asynchronous free zones. Email produces a record that people can point to later. Meetings produce a summary that gets lost. Nothing said in a meeting can be held against you in quite the same way. Decisions made in meetings can be reframed in the next meeting. There's no commit. That's why email started to disappear from some organizations. Because email is traceable, meetings are not, and traceable is risky if you're not confident in your judgment. So what does this mean for you? It means your time is being spent managing someone else's anxiety. Not your work, not your growth, their discomfort with uncertainty. And here's where it gets unfair. The people who get trapped hardest in meeting culture are the reliable ones. The ones who show up prepared. The ones who actually read the pre-read materials. The ones who give clear answers when asked. Those people get invited to more meetings because they make the meeting feel productive. They give the leader something to point to. So you become the person who's always in the room, always contributing, always present. And somehow that presence makes you less visible, not more. Because you're not doing the work that builds your reputation. You're doing the work that makes someone else's meeting look functional. Do you see the trap? You think being useful in the room is building goodwill? It might be, but it's also building a role for you. The role of the person who makes meetings work. And that's not the role that gets promoted. The competent people in the organization start becoming the support infrastructure for the dysfunction at the top. Your competence gets redirected away from the actual work and toward managing the appearance that the leadership structure is functioning. You become the person who makes sure the meeting has an agenda, who sends the reminder, who captures the notes, who tracks the action items that won't actually be acted on, who volunteers to be on the subcommittee that will meet to plan the next big meeting. All of this is invisible labor. It's not in your job description. It's not being evaluated for promotion. It's just something that happens because the system requires it and you're good at it. And because you're good at it, more gets added. The organization trains you through reinforcement to become increasingly essential to the functioning of its own dysfunction. You're not being developed, you're being consumed. Here's what it actually looks like from the inside. You start the week with 12 hours of meetings already blocked. 12 hours. That's before any actual work, before the projects you're responsible for, before the thinking that your job requires. So you start doing your real work in the margins. Early mornings, late evenings, lunch. You compress everything that actually matters into whatever time is left over, and you get it done because you're good, because you're reliable, because that's who you are. But you're exhausted, and the work is worse than it would be if you had space to think. And next week there are 14 hours blocked, because the leader saw how useful last week's meeting was, and they've added a touch point, another check-in, another alignment session. And I want you to understand something clearly, that growth in meetings is not a sign that the organization is getting more collaborative. It's a sign that the leader at the center is getting less confident. Meetings multiply when someone at the top doesn't trust themselves. They schedule more because they're not sure the last one was enough. They add standing calls because they need the feeling of being informed, even when being informed isn't the bottleneck. The problem isn't information. The problem is that they don't know what to do with it, so they gather more. The exhaustion you feel is not a personal failing, it's the design. Organizations that run on meetings are essentially running on the cognitive surplus of people like you. They're taking the brightest, most responsible people and diverting their intelligence and energy away from making things into the much more difficult task of managing relationships and coordinating conversations. It's like hiring Olympic athletes and having them organize the clipboard distribution system. The waste is vast, but the waste is also invisible because the person wasting the resource is the one who benefits. The leader doesn't see it as a cost. They see it as having a high-quality team that can execute anything. They don't realize that the team is executing less than it should, not more, because the time is being spent in meetings rather than in work. The coordination cost has become invisible because everyone's too tired to name it. What happens to the people who push back? Not dramatically, not with speeches, just quietly. The ones who start protecting their time, who say they can't make a meeting and send notes instead, who ask if a decision can be made over email. Those people get a reputation, and not always a good one. They get labeled as not a team player, hard to reach, not collaborative, and that label is the trap, because now you're stuck. You can let the meetings eat your week and become invisible through overpresence, or you can protect your time and become suspect for being absent. Either way, the weak leader wins and you lose. This is the thing that takes a long time to fully understand. The meeting culture isn't just inefficient, it's structurally harmful to the people inside it, and most directly harmful to the people who actually have things to get done, the people who needed the time, the ones whose output matters. They're the ones paying the highest cost. And the person calling the meetings often has no output to protect. Their job is the meeting itself. Coordination, communication, alignment, those are real things. But when they become the entire job, when they expand to fill every available hour, when they replace decision-making instead of supporting it, you're no longer in a functional organization. You're in a theater, and you're part of the cast whether you auditioned or not.